You're listening to the High School Musical Podcast. I'm your host, Frederick Miller, aka the Musical Theater Dramaturg. Last week on the podcast, we dove into the stage adaptation of the 1997 animated film Anastasia, which explored the rumor that Anastasia Romanov, the daughter of Tsar Nicholas II, had somehow survived the assassination of the Imperial Russian family in 1918. The musical explores the fall of the Russian Empire in the early 20th century as its characters grapple with the rise of communism. This week, we're actually going to be staying in Russia with our next musical. Set in the Pale of Settlement of Imperial Russia at the turn of the 20th century, Fiddler on the Roof follows Tevye, a dairyman, and his 5 daughters living in the village of Anatevka. Over the course of the musical, Tevye's way of life is rocked to its core as his daughters disobey the cultural tradition of having arranged marriages, choosing instead to marry for love. Fiddler is perhaps one of the most beloved musicals of the 1960s, and possibly of all time. But the journey to getting there was not easy. We'll discuss the musical's tumultuous road to Broadway today, as well as the men who made it happen. All this today and more on the High School Musical Podcast. As you might have gathered from our previous musicals we've discussed this season, there is always a backstory to how the writers came to work on their material. Many hands played a role in bringing Fiddler on the Roof to life, and we'll begin our discussion today with a man named Sholem Aleichem. Born in Ukraine in 1859, Mr. Alechem's birth name was Solomon Naumovich Rabinovich. His pen name, Sholem Aleichem, was a Yiddish variant of the Hebrew expression meaning, peace be with you. Alechem's father was a rich merchant whose later failed business plunged the family into poverty. In the 1870s, Aleichem began work as a tutor and spent 3 years tutoring a wealthy landowner's daughter, Olga. They would marry in 1883 and have 5 children together. After witnessing the pogroms that swept through the Russian Empire in 1905, Aleichem left Kyiv and immigrated to New York City. The family would later join him in 1914, living first in Harlem and then in the Bronx. Aleichem died at his Bronx apartment in 1916 at the age of 57. In his lifetime, Aleichem achieved moderate success as a writer. By 1890, he was a central figure in Yiddish literature. His most popular stories include those of the dairyman Tevye and his family, chronicled in Tevye and His Daughters, as well as its numerous sequels. The stories, written in Yiddish, were first published in 1894. In the stories, Tevye is a pious Jewish dairyman living in the Russian Empire. The stories follow Tevye's business dealings, the romantic dealings and marriages of several of his daughters, and the expulsion of the Jewish people from their village by the Russian government. Alechem's stories have been dramatized numerous times following his death. There was an adaptation at the Yiddish Art Theater in 1919, a film starring Maurice Schwartz in 1939, and even a musical called Tevye and His Daughters, playing off-Broadway in the late 1950s. There were plans to bring this musical to Broadway, but the plans were ultimately dropped. Enter stage left, Jerry Bach, Sheldon Harnick, and Joseph Stein. Jerry Bach was a composer born into a Jewish family in New York in 1928. Around 1956, he met a lyricist named Sheldon Harnick, who was born into a Jewish family in Chicago in 1924. In 1958, the pair wrote their first musical together called The Body Beautiful, with an American playwright named Joseph Stein, who wrote the book. Stein had been born in New York City in 1912 to Polish immigrants. The Body Beautiful, while being poorly received, captured the attention of producer Harold Prince, who we have talked about at length this season. Separately, Bach and Harnick would go on to write the score for the musical Fiorello in 1959 and win the Pulitzer Prize for Drama and the Tony Award for Best Musical, which they shared with the musical The Sound of Music. In the early 1960s, Bach, Harnick, and Stein decided to team up once again for an idea they had to adapt Alechem's stories to the stage, and thus Fiddler on the Roof began its journey to Broadway. But right from the get-go, there was a bit of apprehension in creating this musical. We'll discuss that right after this. In the early 1960s, World War II was still very fresh in the cultural zeitgeist, specifically the Holocaust, which had claimed the lives of over 6 million Jewish persons, in addition to countless others. Despite the role the US played in the Allies' victory over Hitler and the Nazis, anti-Semitism still presented a major issue for Jewish Americans. When Bach, Harnick, and Stein brought their idea to musicalize Alechiem's stories to producers, there was some skepticism about the musical being, quote, too Jewish to attract mainstream audiences. There was also the struggle of finding a director for the piece. Harold Prince had been approached first, but ultimately turned it down, saying, quote, I told Bach and Harnick that I did not feel comfortable with the shtetl community, that it did not reflect my background, and that I felt a bit at a loss to direct those characters. In turn, Prince recommended Jerome Robbins as the, quote, only person who could give it a universal language. Jerome Robbins, born in New York City in 1918, was a renowned American dancer, choreographer, and theater director. He was born into a Jewish family on Manhattan's Lower East Side, where he became known as Jerry to those close to him. Originally intent on being a chemist, Robbins dropped out of college due to financial reasons and decided to pursue dance full-time. Robbins became a rising star in the late 1930s and through the 1940s, with his breakthrough show being a choreographer for On the Town in 1944. While forging a career on Broadway, Robbins continued to work in ballet, becoming the associate artistic director of the New York City Ballet in 1949. Later works in the 1950s included The King and I in 1951, The Pajama Game and Peter Pan in 1954, and West Side Story in 1957. But it was the unnamed Bach, Harnick, and Stein project that Robbins would identify so ferociously with. Harnick recalls a story told by Robbins shortly after accepting the director job, in which Robbins recalled being taken to Poland by his parents at the age of 6 to the little village where they came from. What was so desperately important to him was that he had gone to Poland, and that village, as many others, had been wiped out during World War II. Harnick theorized that Robbins, quote, had a mission with Fiddler, almost an obsession, and that was to give those shtetls that had been wiped out in World War II, to give them another life on stage. The writing team met with Robbins beginning at least 6 months prior to rehearsals. As they worked on the script and score, Robbins pestered them with questions, asking, what is this show about? What gives these stories their power? The writers kept responding, well, it's about Tevye and his daughters. And Robbins would respond with, no, that isn't good enough. Eventually, someone in the meeting said, it's about the dissolution of the way of life. And that made things click. And Robbins is remembered saying, quote, that's what it is. It's tradition. And if that's what it is, then we have to have an opening number which will set up some of those traditions so that people can see them break down during the show. And that, friends, is how the musical's opening number, Tradition, came to be. And the title of the musical? Well, the writers went back and forth on what the show would be called. One idea was simply to call it Tevye, after its protagonist. But the writers eventually became inspired by various paintings by Marc Chagall, a Belarusian French artist, a part of the modernist movement. While one in particular was a 1912 painting called The Fiddler, the writers have stressed that there was no one painting alone that inspired the musical's ultimate title of Fiddler on the Roof. Fiddler on the Roof played its world premiere in Detroit, Michigan in July 1964, before heading to Washington, D.C. for an additional tryout in August. American comedian and actor Zero Mostel was hired for the role of Tevye, despite his fierce animosity towards Jerome Robbins. Little backstory here. In the 1950s, during the Red Scare, Robbins had testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee and hid his Jewish heritage from the public. Mostel didn't like this and took jabs at Robbins every chance he got during the process. However, because Robbins believed so ferociously in the musical and knew that Mostel was the guy for Tevye, he put up with it to the detriment of production morale. The original production team consisted of scenic designer Boris Aronson, lighting designer Gene Rosenthal, orchestrator Don Walker, and costume designer Patricia Zibrat, who would go on to design Into the Woods in the 1980s. On September 22, 1964, Fiddler on the Roof premiered on Broadway at the Imperial Theater. Its premiere drew praise from the New York Times, with critic Howard Tubman writing, quote, "Fiddler is filled with laughter and tenderness. It catches the essence of a moment in history with sentiment and radiance, compounded of the family materials of the musical theater, popular song, vivid dance movement, comedy, and emotion. It combines and transcends them to arrive at an integrated achievement of uncommon quality." Wow, high praise indeed. Other folks, not so much. Walter Kerr's review in the Herald Tribune called Fiddler a, quote, "near miss, lacking sufficient spirit and emotion to do justice to its historical source." Kerr's review recalled early producers' concerns that the musical would be too, quote, "culturally sanitized." Philip Roth, writing for The New Yorker, cited one such example as the local Russian officer being sympathetic, instead of brutal and cruel, as Shalom Aleicham's stories had originally described him. In the source material, the stories end with Tevye alone, his wife dead, and his daughters scattered. But at the end of Fiddler, the family members are all alive, and most immigrate to America. Despite not being as authentic as some detractors might have hoped for, the show did find the right balance for its time, and became one of the first popular post-Holocaust depictions of the vanished world of Eastern European Jewish people. At the 1965 Tony Awards, Fiddler scored big. Winners included Best Book, Leading Actor, Featured Actress, Producer, Director, Composer and Lyricist, Choreography, Costume Design, and Best Musical. Boris Aronson for Scenic Design was the only nominee not to win their category. The original Broadway production of Fiddler closed on July 2, 1972 at the Broadway Theater, where it had later transferred to from the Imperial. The production had played 3,242 performances during its run and was the first Broadway musical in history to surpass 3,000 performances. At the 1972 Tony Awards, Fiddler was honored with a special Tony Award for being the longest-running musical in Broadway history at the time. But audiences' love affair with Fiddler did not end there. The first Broadway revival opened just 4 years following its initial closure in 1976 at the Winter Garden Theater. Here, Zero Mostel reprised his role as Tevye. A second Broadway revival opened in 1981 at Lincoln Center. 9 years later, the third revival opened at the Gershwin Theater, now today home to Wicked. In 2004, the fourth Broadway revival opened at the Minskoff Theater, which is now home to The Lion King. And finally, in 2015, the fifth Broadway revival opened at the Broadway Theater, the same theater where the original production had closed. Outside of Broadway, Fiddler has made quite the splash as well. A Yiddish-language production was produced by the National Yiddish Theater at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in 2018. And elsewhere, the musical has been seen throughout Europe, South America, Africa, and Australia. So for all of these reasons, Fiddler on the Roof holds a very special place in the history of the Broadway musical. And when we come back, we'll talk about a few more reasons. This season, we've chatted a lot about musicals, new and old. For the older musicals, there's a lot out there about them. Books, documentaries, interviews, podcasts, etc. And it makes sense. They've been around for a while. But also it means that it's more likely that a larger number of people have seen it and can talk about it. Shows like Oklahoma and The Music Man are right up there with a show like Fiddler on the Roof. People a lot smarter than me have argued for Fiddler on the Roof's significance. Theater scholar Elisa Solomon even wrote a book called Wonder of Wonders, A Cultural History of Fiddler on the Roof. She argues, quote, "Beyond its continuing vibrant life in the theater, Fiddler, like no other musical before or since, has seeped into the culture more widely, functioning in sometimes contradictory ways." Interesting. She goes on to position the musical as a, quote, "global touchstone for an astonishing range of concerns. Jewish identity, American immigrant narratives, generational conflict, communal cohesion, ethnic authenticity, and interracial bridge building. If you've been paying attention this season, and I know you have, Fiddler on the Roof seems to share a lot in common with the other musicals we've been talking about. It's easy to say Fiddler is similar to Oklahoma or The Music Man because they're both old, but if you stop and think about what those shows are about, you can start to get an answer as to why they've stood the test of time and why audiences gravitate towards them. Almost all of these musicals we've discussed this season have to do with identity, community building, and settling conflict, whether it's doing it explicitly or implicitly. The Broadway-style musical is uniquely American in that it always seems to somehow speak directly to the American people, even if it's about a tiny village in Russia at the turn of the 20th century. We also cannot overlook the fact and the very strong significance of Fiddler on the Roof being the first mainstream musical to tackle the subject matter of Jewish identity. Elisa Solomon argues that, quote, "The show remains a platform on which Jews engage, work out, and argue over the significance and substance of their identity. It's a source of representation. And even if we're not Jewish, and that's not our lived experience, there's certainly something relatable in this musical for all of us. Family, community, and tradition." As we've said over and over again, this musical is about tradition and what happens when that tradition slowly starts to disintegrate. Do we embrace it? Do we run away from it and deny that it is happening? There's certainly two camps of thought here, and I'm not here to try to convince you of one or the other. Tevye is our protagonist. He's a father, he's a husband, and a key figure in his community. He's also the narrator of our musical, speaking directly to the audience and to his God. Tevye is commanding, a bit of a hothead at times, but loves his family and his daughters more than anything. He takes pride in his home that he has built with his family, and the slightest inconvenience that threatens to unravel that is not to be taken lightly. Now, like we've chatted about our other shows this season, it can be easy to write Tevye off as your stereotypical dad, but don't immediately fall into this trap. Think about why Tevye clings to tradition and his faith so much. It's all he's known. He and his wife Golda received an arranged marriage, just like they're expecting their 5 daughters to do. When everything stays the same for so long, and all of a sudden things change, it can be scary. We may not make the same choices that Tevye does, but we can certainly try to understand why he acts the way that he does. Golda is strong, smart, and is always one step ahead of Tevye, until she's not. Her 3 daughters, Zeidel, Hodel, and Hava, are just like her, strong-minded and not afraid to speak their mind, which causes some issues during the musical. This is a musical that, while its protagonist is a male character, relies heavily on the talent of its women to carry the show. So let's take a moment to talk about the 3 daughters at the heart of this musical. Zeidel is about to be married off to Lazar Wolf thanks to the village matchmaker Yente's maneuvering. But Zeidel is actually in love with her childhood friend, Model, the tailor. She doesn't want to disappoint her father, and she knows that she cannot marry Lazar Wolf. She's the first daughter to disobey tradition. Hodel falls in love with Perchik, a student revolutionary who comes to Anatevka. Perchik is all about embracing change, and this ignites something in Hodel. When Perchik is arrested and exiled to Serbia, Hodel announces her intention to join him. Tevye sees Hodel off at the train station, where she delivers possibly one of the most heartbreaking songs of this entire musical, called Far From the Home I Love. And finally, Hava is the daughter to stray from tradition the most. She falls for Fadika, a Christian, despite being Jewish. That's a big no-no, especially for Tevye. Tevye cannot grasp with the thought of Hava being with Fadika and forbids their romance. This causes Hava to run off with Fika, and Tevye to treat her as dead. That's really rough. All 3 daughters are unique in their own ways, but are united in representing the new. Their parents represent the old. This musical is smart in that it doesn't really play one side as better or correct. It just treats both sides with humanity and love. In perhaps one of the most poignant parts of the musical, the Russians expelled the Jewish population from their villages. The entire village of Anatevka sing of their home and how it has been ripped from them. There is a true love to not just tradition and one another, but to their homeland as well. And one final thing to note about Fiddler on the Roof, and this cannot be understated enough, is that this musical is not all light and fluffy. The vicious attacks and discrimination that the characters face at the hands of Imperial Russia are ruthless, and did in fact happen. There are lighthearted moments in this show, but we should be mindful of the fact that this musical really does handle sensitive material. But that shouldn't deter you from wanting to do it. In fact, it should make you feel excited about sharing this story with your community. Your Anatevka. The High School Musical podcast is researched, written, and produced by Frederick D. Miller, a current PhD student at the University of Pittsburgh. This podcast is made possible through generous funding from Humanities Engage at the University of Pittsburgh, as well as a partnership with Cumberland Valley High School in Mechanicsburg, PA. Thank you for listening, and be sure to give us a follow on Instagram at the MT Dramaturg.